Hi everyone, welcome to another week of Love and Lore. If you're new to my page, my name is Atlachang and I'm an admitted attorney by profession, although I'm currently not practicing. And if you're returning, you are a homie. Anyway, today we're talking about the law of interstate succession, and what the law of interstate succession involves is basically the rules that apply when somebody who dies does not leave a will. How will their estate be distributed amongst the descendants that are remaining? Right. So a scenario that comes up quite often in Black communities is that when somebody dies and there's no will, they call a family meeting and the elders decide how that estate will be divided amongst the relatives or the people that are alive. Sometimes you see like grandmothers or uncles or cousins or brothers, whatever, inheriting from the deceased estate, where there is a spouse who's still alive, or there are children, even though it may be extramarital, who are still alive. So the law of interstate succession basically provides for who is first in line to inherit from the deceased estate. And what we actually see happening in Black communities is a disgrace, I must say. It's sad because a lot of people's rights are not being protected, and a lot of people who are very close to the to the deceased, like the wives or second wives or extramarital kids, are actually not benefiting purely because family elders decide they're cutting them off. That is not right. So I'm here to shed light, but I'd like to say before I go any further that this is not legal advice. If you need any legal advice, please contact a lawyer. I am here just to give information to steer you in the right direction should you know somebody who needs this information, and if this information will be valuable to them. Okay, so interstate succession kicks in when there is no valid will, or when there's a will, but it doesn't meet the formal requirements as provided for in the Wills Act, or there is a will, but it does not include all the assets of the deceased. So for instance, let's say the will only has his cars and the deceased had 5 properties, but there's only 3. The other 2 will be dissolved according to the law of interstate succession. So how it works is that if the deceased dies and he still has a living spouse and children, then his estate will be divided amongst his living spouse and his children. If he has more than one spouse, then his estate will be divided amongst his spouses and his children. Now, the Interstate Succession Act provides that, sorry, my phone's about to die. It provides that the spouse will inherit the greater amount of either the child's share or the child's portion of the estate, or the amount that's set by the Minister of Justice, and that is currently 250,000. So basically, you would calculate the share of the children, and if that share is more than 250,000, then the wife will get that amount. If it's less than 250,000, then the wife will get 250,000, and whatever's remaining of the estate will be divided amongst the children. That's obviously assuming that the value of the estate is more than 250,000, right? It seems that if the estate is less than 250,000, then the children don't inherit at all. The law is trying to avoid a situation where the children inherit more than the spouse. Again, another thing that needs to be factored into the amount that is inherited is the marriage regime. So I'll talk about this in a video that I'll do in the future. I'll talk about marriage regimes in South Africa. Currently, we have in community of property, out of a community of property, and out of community of property with accrual. I'll give an example with in community of property. So you'd calculate the joint estate, and then you divide it into half, right? Remember, marriage is dissolved either by death or divorce. So in this case, it would be death. The spouse would get her 50% from the joint estate. The deceased 50% will then be distributed amongst the spouse again, as well as the children. So just because the spouse got her 50% from the joint estate does not mean she doesn't have a share in terms of interstate succession. It doesn't mean that she doesn't have a claim against the deceased spouse estate. I'm not going to talk about out of community and out of community with accrual. I'm not. If the deceased has no children but just a spouse or spouses, then his estate gets divided amongst the spouses. End of story. If the deceased has just children and no spouses, then the estate gets divided amongst the children. If there's no children, if there's no spouses that the deceased leaves behind, then his estate gets divided amongst his parents. If it's one living parent, it's the mother, then the mother gets everything. If it's the father gets everything. And then we can go into looking at his sisters, half sisters, and all of that. So it takes a while before we even consider other people into the equation. I think it's important to note this, seeing how things are done in the Black communities, is that if there's a living spouse and children, nobody else has a claim to that estate. Right. That in terms of children who inherit from the deceased estate, this can be extramarital children, it can be adopted children, children born from like surrogacy. So it doesn't have to be a child born in a marriage. And also in terms of spouses, it could be more than one spouse, it could be customary marriage, it could be a silver marriage, and it also could be like a same-sex partnership, so long as it's formalized and it's not just like a live-in situation. The live-in situation can get a little bit tricky, so I'm not going to delve into this today either. If you'd like legal advice, please contact your lawyer. Again, it's important to note that certain things can disqualify you from inheriting from the deceased estate. For instance, if the spouse is killed by their spouse, then the living spouse cannot claim from that estate. And it's also possible to repudiate, which is to reject the inheritance, and then your portion then will be divided amongst, for instance, the children or the wives, whatever. Another important factor is that if the deceased, for example, had children, let's say they had 3 children, but only 2 of his children are alive. The third child that the deceased had died, but that child had their own children, then their portion of the estate will be divided amongst their children. Jesus English. Right. So it doesn't mean that just because the child of the deceased is deceased as well, that if they have children, they don't get anything. They get the portion that their parent would have gotten had that parent been alive. Practically speaking, how does this all work? Well, you'd have to go to the Master of the High Court, fill out a death notice, attach the necessary forms, for example, your death certificate, your inventory list, your letter of executorship, and then the estate will begin to be administered, liquidated, and then they must pay the creditors and the debt first that is owed by the deceased before they distribute the remaining amount to the descendants. So it is possible that the estate is insolvent, and that means that there are more liabilities than there are assets, and then subsequently that would mean that the descendants don't inherit anything. It's sad, but it can happen like that. So yeah, that is basically interstate succession in a nutshell. I didn't go into too much detail. I just wanted to give you guys information so that you know what are your basic rights. Another thing that I want to mention, sorry, before we go, the Black Administration Act was largely repealed due to its unconstitutionality, where, like, for instance, it provided that certain male heirs would inherit from the deceased estate, and then, like, other people would not be able to inherit. For instance, the African women, or if you were like the last brother, you didn't inherit anything from the deceased estate. So that's been declared unconstitutional to the extent that it infringes on the right to human dignity, and it also constitutes unfair discrimination. So all those practices should not really be happening in 2020. There are certain circumstances where they could be justified. Again, I'm here to give you legal information, so if you want legal advice, please contact your lawyer. And that's all I have to share for today regarding interstate succession. I hope it does give you some form of direction if you do know somebody who is having a family dispute because the deceased did not leave a will and they're fighting about who gets what. Please, guys, stand up for your rights. Enforce the law. Go to your nearest lawyer. Talk to them. Let them help you. You do have protection, especially spouses and children. I don't like what I'm seeing in this year. I've personally heard a lot of stories about how children haven't inherited from their parents' estate, how spouses have also been excluded by their deceased spouse's family from inheriting. You'll find that the brother inherits something and the spouse gets nothing. Like, the brother shouldn't feature in the equation if the spouse is alive and they are stop it. Okay, so guys, please, you guys have rights. Stand up against people who are doing the wrong thing and fight it. That's all I have to say for today. I hope this helps. I hope it really does. I will see you guys next week. Please like, please share, please subscribe. And that's all I have to say. Cheers.